We will get started in just a moment. It turns out it takes a little time for hundreds of people to join a Zoom, so give me just a few more seconds and I'll get started. I feel like it's a little bit like microwave popcorn. I don't know if anybody remembers the instructions at microwave popcorn, which is you turn it off after the popping slows down. So people are popping in, but I'm going to get started. So welcome everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Andrew Gerber, President and Medical Director at Silver Hill Hospital. I am hosting Grand Rounds today in place of Dr. Jeffrey Katzman for a very good reason, that we have switched places, and Dr. Katzman is the presenter today. I am privileged to welcome him presenting on the topic of loneliness and connection, and I will introduce him in just a moment. A little housekeeping to start. Our next Grand Rounds is on April 10th, when we welcome Dr. Michael Block talking to us on the topic Pharmacological Management of Adolescent Depression, Evidence-Based and Emerging Treatments. I know Dr. Block well, and he's a terrific presenter, so I hope you'll mark it in your calendar and tune in on April 10th to hear him speak. For today's lecture, your questions remain an important part of our Grand Rounds. I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Cheryl Bundy, Director of Spiritual Care at Silver Hill Hospital, where she and I will co-moderate a Q&A discussion with Dr. Katzman at the end of this lecture. All of you who know Cheryl know that she is a terrific contributor to what we do here at Silver Hill, and I am really, really proud and privileged to have her join me today. It's a great opportunity to put forward questions and comments to Dr. Katzman. You can submit those anytime during the lecture by clicking on the Q&A icon or box in your Zoom, and we will sort through them and organize them at the end. So feel free to put them in at any time. It doesn't distract us, and then at the end, of course, we'll take those questions. If you wish to receive CME or CEU credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in your browser when we end the webinar. We will also email a copy of the survey to today's participants. And finally, disclosures. No planners of this activity have indicated a relevant financial relationship with an ACCME defined commercial interest. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and our guest speaker today, Dr. Jeff Katzman. All right, so let me start with some of the more formal aspects of Jeff's introduction. Jeff is Professor Emeritus at the University of New Mexico, Department of Psychiatry, and Director of Education at Silver Hill Hospital here in New Canaan, Connecticut. He's Adjunct Professor at the Yale Department of Psychiatry, and he is the Medical Director for the Project ECHO Resiliency Programs. He is a longtime student and teacher of psychodynamic psychotherapy, attachment, and the role of play in our lives. He has held multiple leadership roles in the American Academy of Psychodynamic Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis, and is currently in advanced training at the Bowen Center for Family Systems. Over the past 3 years, Jeff has supported clinicians through Project ECHO at a weekly call focused on the development of resilience. Through this, he has developed an interest in the impact of loneliness on our mental health, and he has presented this information at the first annual Loneliness Conference in Hull, England, with potential interventions. He is currently a member of the steering committee of the Connecticut Collaborative on Loneliness, which is actually quite a big deal in Connecticut, particularly with one of our senators, Senator Murphy, being a national leader in this regard. And Jeff is also director of the Silver Hill Academy of Research and Education, which is currently devoted its focus to understanding the epidemic of loneliness from various perspectives. So while that concludes the more formal part of my introduction, I can't resist putting something a little more informal, but I'll be brief because I want to get to the main act here. So nowadays, all of our correspondence, chronicles our lives. So I couldn't resist. I went back to the first email of my introduction to Jeff, and it's fun to think back. In some respects, it was not that long ago, but in some respects, it feels like an earlier lifetime. On Sunday, October 4th, 2020, in the morning, I got an email from an old friend and colleague, and actually a former supervisor of mine named David Lopez, who's a wonderful psychiatrist, child medicine psychiatrist in Connecticut and in New York. And he told me that there was this guy named Jeff Katzman who he wanted me to meet. And this is, I'm quoting from the email. He says, Jeff is one of those extremely talented clinicians and educators who are real hidden gems. And that, to me, was the understatement of the year, right? Because I hadn't met yet Jeff. But when I met Jeff, we immediately recognized not only a lot of people we knew in common, but a shared passion. And I had this feeling of warmth and excitement that came across from our first conversations that everybody who knows Jeff will recognize immediately. And I hope that you will feel, and I know that you will feel today as well. Jeff has a humanity about him, a decency, a kindness, and a kind of quiet sophistication about the way he thinks about human beings, their minds, and how to help them feel better. And to me, that really is at the core of everything that Jeff does. So without belaboring the point, you're going to get to see it firsthand. I did have one last thing I wanted to do at the risk of embarrassing Jeff. I did want to welcome Carol and Jerry Katzman, who I believe are tuned in today. Nice to see you again, Carol and Jerry. I wish I could see you. They are Jeff's parents, and they are tuning in, and wonderful people who I hope are feeling the pride of the amazing accomplishments of their incredible son. So, no further ado, let's see if I have anything else I'm supposed to say. Give me 1 second. I will pass the baton over to Dr. Katzman. Over to you, Jeff.
Andrew, thank you. Thank you. It's so fun to remember that email and really kind of the delight I felt when meeting you for the first time. Thank you for the warm, generous introduction, and thank you for allowing me to create a space where we can think about this concept of loneliness here at Silver Hill. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. I wanted to also say that we've created an academy here at Silver Hill, the Silver Hill Academy for Research and Education that we call SHARE. And we're doing all things education through this academy, including thinking about loneliness for the next couple of years. And we'll welcome Cheryl Bundy here during questions and answers. And Cheryl and Ben Bernstein, a psychologist here, the three of us have been really thinking about loneliness and how we can connect with other organizations across the community, the state, and the country. And I have nothing to disclose to you today. And my goals and objectives are that I wanted to talk about the link between loneliness and physical health problems, as well as mental health issues and violence, and describe some model programs addressing the issue. Those are kind of stated goals, but really I'm going to really try to create a tapestry here of zombies and improvisational theater and sociology and gut biodiversity and child development and flying bats and psychodynamic theory and genetic codes and psychedelics and more stuff to create a message that backs what the Surgeon General has been telling us about loneliness. So first I want to talk about, here's kind of 5 components I'll be talking about today. And I want to start by talking about the characteristic and impact of loneliness. And to do that, I was thinking back, when did I first really get interested in this concept of loneliness? And really, it was about 15 plus years ago, where consciously I was really thinking about it. Before I knew any fancy evidence-based psychodynamic psychotherapies, I was referred a patient to help through a crisis. She was a 56-year-old Hispanic female who had found the love of her life 3 years prior, and they had spent all their time together those days, and together they went on a vacation to Australia. While there, her boyfriend had a scuba accident and he drowned, and she was understandably devastated and was referred to me at that time by a common friend. I saw her for 4 years, and the first couple of which she spent with feelings of grief and anger that we shared. And while she put together the story of his life, and she had been a physician herself and decided to retire from medicine to pursue other interests, primarily writing, and she tracked his family story with passion and would bring in new findings each week. After about a year, she was better in the sense that she didn't think about him and the situation every single moment, though something really persisted. And it was something that I didn't feel comfortable really naming at the time. Somehow for me to say, well, you're still lonely, felt pejorative, though I wasn't sure just why. I had been raised in intersubjective and self-psychological paradigms and thought it was a kind of pejorative or mean thing to say. I had the sense that I had become the one person she talked to all week. And though I felt that was important, was it what I was supposed to be doing? Was this therapy? How do I even code it? There was no code for lonely on my billing sheet. And I would have to keep saying adjustment disorder, chronic. From time to time, I'd ask, what do you think we're doing here? And she'd tell me at times how important this was. But I wasn't sure if being a contact for a lonely person was really therapy as I understood it, uh, though it indeed felt therapeutic. Then one day she asked me if I watched much television. I only watched one show at that time with my kids who had gotten me into it, and this was a show about zombies walking the earth and a band of survivors trying to make it together in the apocalypse. It was The Walking Dead. We would start to talk about this after session, and she'd say, "So did you see it?" And I would look forward to those moments after our session where we could talk about The Walking Dead. And she was really smart about it. And then it began to enter our sessions more and more. And I felt like, is this really therapy? But I remembered a supervisor of mine, Bernie Branchaft, and his article about looking at clouds outside the window with a young boy who never felt that anybody cared about him or understood him. And and his feeling heard for the first time. These days, I miss seeing this patient. So something was really happening beyond words in which we were both coming to life amidst about a conversation about zombies and finding our way through the loneliness she talked about and the loneliness that I began to remember in myself over the time of my life, something I hadn't thought about. Some years later, I happened to be writing a book about improvisational theater as a guide to overcoming loneliness uh, in our world with my teacher, Dan O'Connor, and we found ourselves suddenly while writing amidst the pandemic and really, really lonely. And at that point, became very interested in what's going on with loneliness. So loneliness, as I'm alluding to, carries with it really a high stigma. It's like we don't really want to say we're lonely or ask somebody if they're lonely. And we don't measure it like other factors. So, we ask pain scales in primary care, but we don't say, "Are you lonely?" And it seems like it could be offensive. It's nowhere in the DSM-5 nomenclature, but it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous, and it happens to us multiple times across our lives and even across the course of a day. If I ask you to write a song right now, which I will, to think of a song about loneliness, something will come to your mind just like that. Um, Here's a list that came to my mind in, I don't know, a few minutes, and I could keep going and going. So the songs all around us, literature, poetry, so much of it is about loneliness and needing to feel connected. So if we think to ourselves, which I started to do while writing, what is loneliness and what does it feel like? And you start to remember it, but you can start to remember or create a kind of personal journal in your mind about loneliness and what did it feel like recently when you experienced it? And what were those circumstances? And if you follow that feeling back, can you get to an earlier experience? How far can you go back to where you remember this experience of loneliness? Um, and I ask us this just to help with the understanding that this is something that we all wrestle with across our lives, whether it's feeling ostracized at school or moving geographically or ending a marriage or carrying on in life following the death of a partner. It impacts men and women equally at different times of our lives. And probably the best way it's measured in research is through the UCLA Loneliness Scale, which has a now shortened 3-item version. It looks like this. How often do you feel that you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out? And how often do you feel isolated from others? And these are questions that we're not generally asked, though they're pretty important. And England took this up a couple decades ago as something very important, and they created a minister of loneliness to help with the problem um, that they were seeing, that they were facing. It was really only recently that our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who had been interested in loneliness and in his classic book, Together, in April of 2023, he made a statement that our epidemic of loneliness and isolation has been an underappreciated public health crisis that has harmed individual and societal health, and that our relationships are a source of healing and well-being hiding in plain sight, one that can help us live healthier, more fulfilled, and more productive lives. And he now has a whole report, which I'll cite along the way. But to give you a sense of how important this is, in America, Cigna did a large study online of 20,000 adults administering the whole UCLA loneliness scale. The scores range from 20 to 80 on that scale, and people scoring over 43 are considered lonely to some extent. Well, more than half of the people answering that survey said they always or sometimes feel that no one knows them well. And the average score was 44. The average score, well, most Americans are considered lonely. And a recent study of 53,000 midlife individuals in the US and 13 different European nations had us in the US ranked at the top as the loneliest people in the study. So what is loneliness? I asked you to kind of see what does it feel like? It feels different for all of us, but it is some kind of signal, an aversive signal that probably evolutionarily was meant to motivate us to join because it's to our advantage, our reproductive advantage in evolution, to not get hurt by being alone and by belonging to a pack. So lonely people exhibit some specific features when they get lonely, like they become hypervigilant to social threats and have a reduced reaction to positive social situations. And this can reinforce lonely people's suspicion of other people, and it can become a vicious cycle. And soon they begin to have physical symptoms and psychological symptoms that we talk about. So some of these are many mental health issues, including anxiety and depression, and greater risk for symptoms of PTSD and for addiction and suicide attempts. And when somebody has a traumatic event and feels isolated in that traumatic event, there's a greater loss of meaning in life and limitations to post-traumatic growth. Loneliness is very much associated with substance use, particularly in adolescent population when it's first used as a coping mechanism, and it was greatly exacerbated in the pandemic. And we can think about why the longstanding attraction of groups like AA and NA, and probably those groups facilitate a sense of belonging. Loneliness is among the most prominent risk factors for both suicidal behaviors and completions. It's very important in college students and the elderly, without a gender difference, though marriage seems to be important. I'll talk about it in a little bit. We can all kind of understand that pretty well. I think the shocker really here is the physical toll that loneliness takes on our body. In one way, that can be because we are more likely to engage when we're lonely in risky or self-medicating behaviors, smoking, overeating, transient sexual encounters. But there's something else going on because loneliness is associated with coronary heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, inflammatory diseases. Equivalent to smoking, as many of you on the line know, 14 cigarettes a day. The Surgeon General has said there's a 30% increased risk of heart disease and stroke, a 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. Chronic loneliness is a contributor to early death more than obesity, excess use of alcohol, or lack of exercise. and it's associated with 60% increased likelihood of premature death. Lonelier cancer patients pass away at an earlier age, and one study said that there's a loneliness-related death in America every 3 minutes. This is radical to me. We're just uncovering the relationship between the GI system and the mind and psychological issues. But there have been studies now looking at folks who rate themselves as lonely. In this one study, there are 184 adults, and measures were taken of loneliness, wisdom, compassion, social support, and social engagement. And then fecal samples were taken from this population. And those who had a richer, more diverse sample with fecal sample, so more biodiversity in their GI system, had less associated loneliness and greater sense of wisdom and compassion and social support and social engagement generally, meaning there's something maybe about a diversity of people or a group of people that we hang out with, and actually the diversity of bacteria in our GI system. Loneliness and pain are also very much related. People who suffer from pain often feel alone and not understood well. This is a pretty interesting study that I'll return to a couple times, in which volunteers were asked to participate in a study that's a virtual ball playing game where at first they're thrown the ball online virtually, and then they're kind of excluded. And there's fMRI taking a look at what's going on in their brain, and the pathway that is seen in the exclusion and then related to feelings of loneliness during this is the same pathway that we see in the generation of pain. I'm going quickly because I have a lot of slides, but these will be made available with the references if people want to take a look at these studies. So where does our experience of loneliness come from? And so one question we can begin to ask is it genetic? Are we more likely to experience loneliness? Is there some heredity to that? And look at these studies show that there is about a 50% heredity rate. I'm looking at twin and adoption studies, but we don't really have candidate genes that can show us you're at greater risk for loneliness. A little bit in looking at the oxytocin receptor gene, oxytocin being a hormone that allows us to feel closer and trusting and bonding, and particularly one, the GG genotype at this particular region. People that have that have greater sociability and trust. And so there were many studies done looking at different populations and do they have difference in this genetic sequence. And most were not significant in terms of relationship to loneliness. Only two, one with adolescent girls and one with pregnant women who had the GG genotype and related less loneliness. And there is also some emerging data about the serotonin transport gene. And for those who have the short allele, copies of that genotype, they show greater vigilance during threat that seems like that it may be associated with propensity toward loneliness. I think what's more interesting are epigenetic changes that we are beginning to uncover related to loneliness, that there's a change in the transcription process of our genes and when we're feeling lonely. And in reading kind of, I don't know, evolutionary stories about why this might be, we can think, well, maybe we need to be one way when we're part of a pack, but maybe it's to our evolutionary advantage when we lose contact with the pack. So these two studies, one was with older adults comparing 6 lonely individuals to 8 non-lonely individuals. And there was an upregulation of 78 genes and downregulation of 131 genes. And they involved different biological systems. But in general, those genes that were upregulated had to do with the immune system. and that there was some change in the immune system as a result of being lonely that were actually replicated by another study in 2011. The UK has done a lot of studies around the financial costs of loneliness, around 10,000 pounds per person per year, due to a lack of problems with well-being and health and work productivity. And it costs employers there in the study $2.5 billion a year in lost productivity and sickness. So we can look at one component of loneliness, which we call social isolation, where you have a desire to connect, but something is getting in the way. And part of the Surgeon General's report talks through what are some individual factors like disease and physical and mental health issues and differences in race and gender and socioeconomic status. And then the nature of our relationships and what's our community like? Are there open spaces and places to gather? And what are the schools there like? And then the norms and values in society. And these all contribute to our sense of social isolation. Also, when thinking about our contacts, this is Cacioppo's work, who's a kind of pioneer in the loneliness world, describes three types of social needs and loneliness, that we need intimate relationships, people who we're closest to, but we can really, there can be about 5 to 10 people that we have the bandwidth for in that group. And then we have relational needs, which are maybe 15 to 40, maybe people we see at work, people we see during the day, and then collective, maybe over 100 people that maybe we know around the country or around the world through different organizations. And that actually we need all three of these. And one of the things about COVID was that we were really kind of locked in there with A and really missing a lot of times B and C. So if we look at trends in social connection, also from the Surgeon General report, you can just see those from 2003, the drops, the increase in social isolation, but the decrease in social engagement, the decrease in engaging with friends and in companionship. And this was described by Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone, where he started to track what is the origin of isolation and loneliness, and talked about in his book the appearance of the television, so that families who used to go to bowling leagues were now sitting more huddled in their own homes watching television. And we can go from there extracting to the advance of technology and what's happened in terms of all of us being locked into our cell phones and social media and how that's changed the nature of our contacts. We can take a look at that. The marriage rate has decreased from 1980, where 6% of 40-year-olds were never married. Now in 2021, 25% of 40-year-olds were never married. And really, most parents say that financial independence is critical, but only about 20% say it's important for their kids to marry. Yet there is something very protective about marriage relative to loneliness. In data from 17 nations across the world, it's marriage that's associated with substantially less loneliness, not parenthood. And these are kind of different variables from those studies. I want to talk a little bit about the development of the incel community. The incel community originally started by someone named Alana, a woman who was having trouble finding a partner, who did, but the word was taken over by a group of men who shared misogynistic ideas and had difficulty making contacts online, and describe in studies a desire to belong somewhere, but they had a greater degree of depressive and anxious symptoms and fear of being single. So this has really resulted in, and it's interesting to think about how people connect now, how people date. And they do that through online dating generally. It's more unusual to meet somebody in person or have an opportunity for that. And because of the filters, people who wind up in these communities describe being filtered out. And when they are matched with somebody, so that they can communicate, they report not receiving a response 3/4 of the time, which is nearly twice the rate of non-incel men. They're far less likely to go on a date or have physical contact or be in a relationship. as a result of a dating app. So to say that there's something about the way that people meet now that's resulting in loneliness and a need to belong to other places. If we look about social isolation across the lifespan, just as a brief survey, we can see in youth that younger adults are more likely than those who are in older ages to say they are feeling lonely often or always, and only 5% say they never feel lonely. Those who feel lonely at age 12, it's pretty stable to age 18, and positive family influences seem to be protective, and the loneliness is correlated with sleep problems. Cell phones, I'll talk about a couple times here, and I've mentioned once already, but more screen time is associated with increased rates of loneliness. So there are some studies that that if you pick it up as opposed to spend time on it, that there's something actually associated with that that's a decrease in loneliness. Perhaps if it's used as a way to meet and to connect to each other as opposed to lose yourself into the cell phones. And cell phone addiction, mobile phone addiction is decreased with enhanced social support. If you look at college, this is a big time when people feel lonely and homesick, and they miss what's dear to them. And nearly 1 in 4 university students say they're lonely all or most of the time. So people who go to college are often exposed to new cultures and don't feel the support of where they came from and need to belong somewhere. And so in the name of belonging, we have an emergence of tribalism, really, and I'll belong here. These will be my people. I've been struck, really, when you go into a college dorm. When I remember college, the doors were all open, people hanging out, eating pizza in the hallway and walking into people's rooms. But now most college dorms, if you walk in, the doors, because they're safety doors, they're all shut. So you don't even really know if somebody's in their room, and it becomes more difficult to meet, and that a reliance more on texting and social media. And often there's even competition for clubs, and people can lose connection to passions that they once had because they can't get into those things in college. Interesting. We all know this is a time where people can feel lonely, but the studies actually of loneliness and kind of empty nest syndrome when the kids have left have almost exclusively been done in China, and talking about the result of urbanization. But in those studies, they're the parents who've been left have generally higher loneliness and depression scores. Loneliness is associated with aging, and large studies show up to about 30% of individuals over 70 endorse loneliness at least some of the time. It's been associated with impaired daytime functioning and reduced physical activity, poor physical health and cognitive performance. And when we get sick, as we age, it limits our ability to interact with others, decreases our energy, and others may not be as inclined to be with us. We spend more time in doctor's offices, and we can have a kind of silent suffering from our medical conditions that we don't talk about. And we can find sometimes fewer resources that can help us. Loneliness at work is pretty important to think about, as we spend a lot of time there. Those of us at work, it's 8, 9, 10 plus hours a day. So the Gallup organization, they have a question which has long intrigued me. It says, do you have a best friend at work? It's question 10 on their survey. And that seems to be, it's correlated with huge things. Someone who has a best friend at work is 7 times more engaged and far less likely to leave their organization. Friends stay together. And actually, if a friend leaves, it's more likely that another friend will leave. And this is how you have organizations in which multiple people leave because they no longer feel this sense of belonging. Another thing that happens in an organization is people get promoted. This slide, thanks to my friend Randy Welton. Well, we've talked about this. When you're a supervisor, you have fewer peers as you rise up the mountain, and your peer group gets smaller. and you may not be so connected to them. So how you are connected at work is important. And this has, of course, been exacerbated by our virtual meetings and the way that we interact online, which some of us do much of the day. And I would say a particular problem with this is that we miss chatter, we miss hallway experiences. And there's something called Zoom etiquette, in which we're supposed to raise a virtual hand and take turns, and the leader will answer the questions in time, which actually prevents a sense of connection, really, as people feel alone in their Zoom cells, locked in a box, often turning to keeping their cameras off. There's whole literature around racial discrimination and loneliness. And just a few studies here for people to look at, that 38% of people whose ethnicity is Black, Asian, or minority say they often feel alone, like they have no one to turn to. In the workplace, workers from ethnic minorities are more likely to feel that they often or always have no one to talk to at work. And almost half the people who had experienced discrimination at work or in their local neighborhood reported being always or often lonely. Sexual orientation and gender diversity is another thing we need to think about in terms of communities who experience higher degrees of loneliness. These are three references that describe that as well. We all know that, like I said, Europe was thinking about loneliness far before COVID, but I think a lot of us became acutely aware of how problematic the pandemic was. With the nature of the virus, that we had to be 6 feet apart, with everything becoming online, and then our actually disagreements about whether we should return to work or not, and now whole cohorts of students raised online through elementary school who have kind of lacked social engagement. And we know that psychological well-being during the pandemic was associated with attendance to health, social, and spiritual needs, and inversely correlated with loneliness. The pandemic led to an increased sense of loneliness around the world, and it was higher in a cohort that was studied following the pandemic than prior. And again, from the Surgeon General's report, social connection really has three major components. The structure of our relationships, that's like the number and variety of the relationships, the function, how well they serve our needs, and the quality, our level of satisfaction with those. I want to talk about something else, though. This has been about how we become isolated from each other, but there's something else called emotional loneliness. That's really often a result of earlier deprivation of responsiveness, leading to the sense of internal loneliness, even when people, when other, so that we feel alone even when we're with other people. Stephanie Kachopa, who I mentioned before, and her husband said that loneliness has been associated with objective social isolation, depression, introversion, or poor social skills. However, studies have shown these characteristics are incorrect, and that loneliness is a unique condition in which an individual perceives himself or herself to be socially isolated when among other people. I referenced The Walking Dead with my patient before, and so if you can imagine, these are The Walking Dead is about zombies. And one of the terrors about this actually is that they can't communicate with one another. They're locked in themselves, even though they're in a herd. They um, they can't connect with one another. I think that's our current version of this. That as we're together, often we don't. You can look around in a restaurant and see people at tables, and people are looking down at cell phones, almost as though we've lost a sense of our ability to connect. So generally speaking, I would say human beings are wired to connect from the beginning of life. It's what we do. So the question becomes, what happens? I think I forgot to click the little boxes, so I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. And yeah. All right. So I'm going to play something for you. that is from Ed Tronic still face. And so I've seen this, I think, about 400 times. And we'll have Claudia Gold, who's in work with Dr. Tronic, talk to us later in Grand Rounds. But in this paradigm, a mother and a baby are invited into a room, and they interact, and the mother's then told not to smile. And I think when we see the baby's reaction, we can begin to think about what does loneliness feel like at the beginning of life if we're not responded to. Jane, if you can't hear this, can you give me a text? Hopefully the sound will come through.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'm here. And what do you do? Oh, yes. Oh, what a girl.
All right. So when we think about that, that's a little different than the more demographic information I've been presenting to you about loneliness in our world and the various forces. This is something a little different. This is more than social isolation. This is actually how we can feel alone when we're with other people, that we don't belong. And one can imagine that if our whole growing up or early experiences were met with parents on a cell phone, parents busy with lots of different things, or parents who had their own unresponsive parents that as the attachment literature would talk about, that actually it would make it so we wouldn't really be able to trust connecting. We wouldn't feel that our world was validated. So looking at some psychodynamic heroes of mine and their ideas about loneliness, Frida von Reichmann, she wrote a paper called Loneliness back in 1959 and said it's quite a difficult feeling to talk about because it is actually so deadening and shameful, as I described. She delineates it from potential positive experiences of being alone, which can lead to creativity. She characterizes the extreme difficult experience of loneliness, coming close to what one might consider inner deadness. And then she describes various patients, one who's unable to communicate other than to move a finger. And she moved a finger back as a way to begin communication, reminding me of my conversation talking about The Walking Dead. In her description of loneliness, she describes it as an unspeakable suffering leading to emotional paralysis and helplessness, and a mismatch between the need to connect and the ability to do so. Winnicott has many famous ideas that people on the line, I'm sure many know of these true and false self and transitional logics. And one of them is about the capacity to be alone. To be clear, in this conversation about loneliness, I'm not talking about the joy of being alone or on retreat or with ourself. But Dr. Winnicott wrote a paper, The Capacity to Be Alone, in which he said, in order for us to be able to be alone, we have to have had an experience of being alone with an attuned other person. And that then we can carry that experience of belonging and relatedness with us throughout the world. A beautiful article is by Harry Guntrip, a psychoanalyst who was in analysis with Fairbairn and then with Winnicott, in which he develops this idea of the schizoid dilemma and talks about his own analysis in which he had a lack of an attuned parent and describes this idea of the abandonment of the heart, where he stopped feeling, and a dream of his where he saw his mother, black, immobilized, staring fixedly at space, totally ignoring me as I stood at one side staring at her and feeling myself frozen into immobility. And we think about just what the still face looks like and the importance of an attuned other person. And Kohut, who says, man can no more survive psychologically in a psychological milieu that does not respond empathetically to him than he can survive physically in an atmosphere that contains no oxygen. Michael Agan, in his book, Psychic Deadness, talks about the need for early attunement. And he talks about, without it, that we have some pockets of deadness within us, and that this can be pervasive for many people, and relates back to this idea of the walking dead. So this is important. And another thing to think about is what happens in our families that can lead us to feel alone. And Murray Bowen talks about the complexity of families and how they are our closest people to us. They're that inner circle I described, but we all must move and create our own life. And that can go well, or that can go anxiously. And difficult experiences that have happened through the generations can get passed down. And kids can be scapegoated or blamed, and conflicts can arise within relationships in a family, so that whole family parts of family trees can be lost or cut off, and we don't know them. Our family can become highly reactive to what's going on in society as well. So it's important to think in terms of the generation of how lonely we feel, what kind of relationship and contacts can be understood and potentially healed in a family. Loneliness and violence are also connected in really important ways. And they're a risk for a perpetrator creating a violent experience, and then really important for understanding the experience of the victim. If we even just look at neighborhood violence, these are a couple studies in which loneliness in these neighborhoods was actually correlated with the level of crime. I think this is a study around child perpetrators, and that those sexually soliciting minors online had a higher degree of social anxiety and loneliness associated with their particularly problematic internet behavior. Loneliness was the mediating variable in this study, in which those who've experienced trauma were able to work through traumatic experiences versus the tendency for enacting further violence. Social isolation was found the most important variable and most open to potential intervention in a cross-section of 177 mass shooters when looking at their narratives. Looking at autobiographical texts of these shooters, existential loneliness has emerged really as paramount. And this is a study looking at 15 school shooters and their personal histories and experience of loneliness being paramount. And individuals who are lonely are found by organizations who are seeking lonely and alienated individuals to join them in potential experiences of hate. And this article just describes that. In terms of the experience of violence, in this study, there were over 1,200 community participants, and the single greatest contributor to loneliness was the experience of interpersonal violence in a current relationship. This study looked at 21 domestic violence survivors, and often the people who were conducting the study were the first to ever use the term loneliness in this group. And then a great intense narratives around the idea of loneliness and being unseen stemmed from even just using the word. I'll read through some of this here. The pain of loneliness is particularly acute for those who've been failed by the very social institutions designed to provide them with assistance and ensure their protection, including law enforcement, courts, social service agencies, and healthcare providers. So there's a loneliness within the relationships, but then some of our systems reinforce the experience of loneliness. Loneliness may also lead to and flow from changes to an individual's cognitions about him or herself. And lonely people are more likely to perceive themselves as inferior, worthless, unattractive, socially incompetent, and worthy of shame. And that can lead to actually feeling unworthy to leave a difficult relationship, such that domestic violence victims who rate themselves as feeling the most lonely are the most likely to return or remain in abusive relationships. And when they leave for shelters, as I was alluding to, they often face profound experiences of loneliness as they're cut off from their traditional sources of support. It's the primary reason individuals accept apologies from abusers and return to those relationships. And participants in this study who were interviewed said that they often left shelters because those shelters cut them off from important relationships and their feelings of loneliness in the shelters. This psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse all escalated during COVID-19, where victims were isolated at home and trapped in with perpetrators, often with decreased financial resources and lack of privacy to make phone calls, and cut off from pre-existing other supportive relationships. It's important to understand, I think, that loneliness is critical in terms of somebody emerging from a domestic violence situation, in that often close friends have been frustrated and people's circle of support has been reduced. And so people who do this work talk about pre-work and building trust with some individuals so that they can feel support in leaving abusive relationships. And this is a study of almost 2,000 adolescents in Spain and around child-parent violence, and it was associated with higher rates of loneliness and suicidal ideation and alexithymia, meaning that so I was talking about interpersonal violence, but in domestic violence, but child-parent violence also is extremely associated with loneliness. And early life adversity and exposure to violence early in life is linked to later life loneliness. So I want to talk a little bit about loneliness in medicine from both sides. All of us go to medical appointments with various frequencies, and we can think about what that's like and why have we set it up that way. But the environment of the room often is lonely. We're often left alone. Sometimes people can't go back with us. Sometimes we repeat our story to 3 different people who don't talk to each other. There's sometimes little energy to know you as a person. Often people can be behind and moving fast, and you may have been waiting for a long time. And at the time where you may be receiving frightening news, it can be an extremely lonely experience. On the other side, people who go into medicine and clinical care, and particularly mental health training, can experience loneliness through their career. there can be a lot of competition, for example, to get into these positions, and then a focus in training on boundaries. So someone going into psychiatry often is exposed to learning about keeping distance between themselves and the people that they're caring for. So people who were often very interested in helping people and caring about them are more focused on keeping a distance. And then there can be stigmas within society, particularly of being a mental health provider. And it's built on transient social relationships of training and knowing more information than you know what to do with than your friends, and then an experience of a gap between practice and beliefs. Dr. Gerber referenced a program I've been involved in that meets on Mondays from 1 to 2. It's a resilience program. We put out this workbook. This group of us from around the country, including a team here from Silver Hill. Really, we've worked with about 3,000 clinicians around the world, really, at this point, around building a sense of resilience, both internally and an ability to understand and cope with systems problems. One of which is loneliness that comes really from the electronic medical record. I just kind of can't believe this study. If you can look at it, emergency medicine physicians spend 44% of their day doing data entry with 4,000 clicks per day and only 28% of the day spent with patients. So you can think back to your medical appointments and really the gratitude I feel personally every time a doctor I'm talking to spends time talking to me and not looking at the chart. So loneliness is something that actually affects doctors and providers that we need to think about. People in private practice are alone, but we tolerate that, really. Then you can see, this is again from my friend Randy Welton, these images of doctors alone. And that seems okay, but actually, if we think about what I said at the beginning of this talk around it being about 14 cigarettes, in terms of our risk factor, we would never tolerate these images of doctors smoking cigarettes. So why is this okay? We wonder how do people who are providing clinical care support themselves. So I'm going to talk about some interventions, and I'll go back to Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, who I talked about, who says really how important curiosity is in psychiatry. She says, if I were asked to answer this question in one sentence, I would reply, the psychotherapist must be able to listen. This does not appear to be a startling statement, but it is intended to be just that, to be able to listen and to gather information from another person in this other person's own right without reacting along the lines of one's own problems or experiences of which one may be reminded, perhaps in a disturbing way, is an art of interpersonal exchange without which few people are able to practice without special training. To be in command of this art is by no means tantamount to actually being a good psychiatrist, but it is the prerequisite of all intensive psychotherapy. So Peter Fonagy is a creator of mentalization, and I had the joy of meeting with Dr. Fonagy and taken by this little tape from him. So I'm going to share this minute of Dr. Fonagy talking.
What mentalization-based treatment, I believe, does, and does better than most other treatments, is make people feel that the communication that they are receiving can be trusted by taking seriously their experience, believing in them, rather than treating their experience as something that needs to be adjusted or corrected or reconfigured in some way, as something that we need to understand, that we are curious to understand. But actually, to be honest, as the years pass, I less and less believe there is anything that I say that is helpful to the people I treat. I think that my attitude in sitting side by side with them and actually trying to understand and be curious about their internal world, I reestablish a kind of trust that they can have in other people. They can open themselves up to learn from other people. And that is part of re-engaging in a social world that our genes have prepared us for.
All right. So Dr. Fonagy created this idea of mentalization and just put briefly in a picture, it's can we hold another person's in mind and mind in mind. And I've kind of referred to this along the way. But for example, if I'm feeling a certain feeling, say here happiness, and I look inside of myself, if I were the one with the happy face there or happy enough, um, can someone else know and relate to me what my state of mind is? And if I have an experience that they get me, that really is what trust is. And then as that opens up more and more, that I experience a sense of we between us, I'm going to trust whatever they have to say because I know they know me, which is the first step that's so often skipped in human relationships. So what are important things to think about in addition to curiosity and listening to people? But one way that we can take care of ourselves that's been shown to reduce loneliness is incorporating a mindfulness practice into our lives. And it has been shown to have to show a reduction of the protein markers of this immune response that I was talking about earlier. So it may be good for our psychological health, for the experience of feeling connected to ourselves, as well as our biological function, as is spirituality. That those connected to a spiritual practice or religious participation experience less loneliness, and family conversations around spirituality and spiritual experiences and having a consolidated spiritual identity correlate with decreased family and remote romantic and social loneliness. Up there in the top, I just kind of wrote, was a note to myself, I didn't finish loneliness in the clergy, that just like in the clinical practices, being in the clergy also, people need to take care of themselves to buffer against the experience of loneliness. So this is a large family diagram, a genogram, and I happen to draw it. It's of my own family, and I went back 8 generations, and I have to say that my experience of connecting and finding out where I belonged in the world and was remarkable in terms of feeling connected to something bigger. And I think that that's another interesting way to conceptualize how we can feel less lonely is to know where we came from and where cutoffs may have happened and what we can do about them. The Surgeon General talks about 6 pillars of social connection. He talks about strengthening our social infrastructures in our communities and thinking about public policies and mobilizing the health sector and reforming digital environments and deepening our knowledge about loneliness and building a culture of connection. Some of these things I've mentioned as real risk factors. And Dr. Gerber mentioned the Connecticut Collaborative to End Loneliness, a very active group here in Connecticut that's mission really is to raise awareness of the problem of loneliness and engage healthcare professionals and eliminate the stigma of loneliness to address young adult and older adult loneliness. And they have set up these conversations to talk about loneliness where people have been coming throughout Connecticut. This is just one movement throughout the state that I'm aware of. I know that Senator Murphy has organized large groups of people who are involved in thinking about loneliness in all different kinds of ways, from public spaces to organizing block parties. People are very motivated in this direction, including this organization called Soar Together, and that it's in Fairfield County. And these are organizations that you can take a look at and get involved. SOAR is giving social prescriptions to people to help understand how to motivate them toward decreased isolation. in their lives. I mentioned that we've created this academy called SHARE, the Silver Hill Academy for Research and Education, and some things that we're doing in our focus around loneliness is that there will be an original play, The Loneliness Cure, on May 6th at Fairfield University. I'll be a discussant there with some other people, really tracking the lives of 5 people. And though it's a fictional play, it really gets to the heart, I think, of loneliness, and understanding it had been full, but with a waiting list, but maybe it's moving to a bigger venue, so can be seen. The New Canaan Library, I'll be speaking with Dr. Bernstein and Cheryl Bundy on loneliness and connection. And we'll talk about the date of that as well in the Q&A session. We'll have a movie night on October 18th from Garrick Duckler, who has put together, he's a psychoanalyst who's put together some films that he'll show in New York with a discussion around kind of some of the psychodynamics of loneliness that I was alluding to. And Peter Fonagy will be here on November 22nd, talking about mentalization, and here at Silver Hill, and followed the next day, a conversation about ambit, which is how does a team deal with understanding multiple perspectives. And so if you're aware of other things, you can put those in the chat, and we can collect those as resources too. Also, Patrick Kennedy will be coming here, and I'll get the date for that during the Q&A to talk about his new book, Profiles in Mental Health Courage. What can we do about loneliness ourselves? We can inquire about it during our clinical visits. We can build our own supports to be able to care for other people and just take care of ourselves. We can connect with somebody today who we hadn't planned to connect with. We can send them a text. We can think about the moment of being understood by another person and try that on for somebody else. We can provide people with information and strategies that can help to cope with loneliness, including strategies that help identify and manage self-defeating thoughts that are associated with loneliness. We can build not just our physical, but our social infrastructure and think about what that looks like. And we can work to restore our commitment to each other and to the common good, and how we transmit that to our families, to our children, grandchildren. And I had a friend who doesn't know I'm talking about this, named Bruce Kimura in medical school. And he once told me, he said, Jeff, go surprise somebody today and call them on the phone. It was back a few decades. And so that's what we had to do. You couldn't just send a text, but you had to call someone on the phone, which I did a few times. And I'm indebted to Bruce for this philosophy about just reaching out to somebody and how it really got into my DNA. And we can just decide to connect at the market, checking out, sending a random text, sending a delivery to somebody. We can make even a spreadsheet of our most important connections and what we could do to really kind of wow people. We can think about groups we've known and think about, is there a way we could have like a Zoom reunion with them? We can think about new interests or hobbies that might pull us into meeting new people, and we can consider deeply our spiritual and our faith connections to something bigger, and what do we think about that, and how are we pursuing this? And Cheryl Bundy, who was about to come back here, shared this idea of building a jigsaw puzzle, and I have seen this in action, where somebody has a jigsaw puzzle in their house and visitors add to it, and it's what a great way to connect with somebody. But I could suggest all day, just like I suggested to my patient who got mad at me, you should join a book club, and she rebuked me. But the ideas aren't important. The ideas are generated by all of us. What can you do for others and for yourself today? We can think about at work, stopping in the hallways and chatting with each other about having coffee or lunch together, walking with someone and not behind them. Adding something connecting to rounds, to a virtual rounds, or to a meeting. we can socialize outside of work, and we consider some in-person time. My friend, Bob Stocking, does something called a reflective best self exercise, which is pretty amazing. I've seen in action where somebody who's participating, like an employee who's participating in this, rather than getting what we call 360 feedback with everybody's opinions about them, they get 360-degree stories where people write a story about their memory of them acting as their best self. And so they're given a packet full of stories that are held in the mind of other people. It's a tremendous, tremendous experience, and what a way to know you're seen and overcome loneliness. You can think about our various connections in family and friends and faith and community and neighbors, the hobbies we're involved in, and how are we connecting in those places. And just to end here, some questions we can consider. Who's important in our lives, and have we spoken to them recently, and what might they really appreciate from us? Can we consider our relationships and our family and our friendships in the workplace, and what's the one thing we could do to deepen those and let people know that you're thinking of them? And is there someone in your life who detracts from your sense of well-being, and how might you put limits or boundaries around that relationship if it's not adding to your sense of connection? And can you consider really critical relationships with parents, children, significant others, and what do they really need from you right now? And is there something that you do to keep from engaging with others, a way that ends up decreasing your presence and connection with others? And can you begin to notice how you might isolate yourself at times and consider whether this is ultimately helpful? A few other models. This is my friend Leon McQuaid started Andy's Man Club in Europe that has thousands of men now who get together on Monday nights, I believe, and talk about their feelings, and have great pride in doing that. I'm always floored by their model. Just briefly in a minute, psychedelics are now emerging to talk about everything. And there is some things to think about with psilocybin, with MDMA, in terms of their role in facilitating connection. And is that what they do? Connection to oneself and connection to something bigger. If I'm not involved with psychedelics, I am involved with improvisational theater, which I find a way out experience also. And so in the name of time, I'm not going to play this, but I suggest anybody to go to an improv show or take an improv class. And our books that we've written about improv and loneliness and improv and life talk about some of the guides that we can learn when we're spontaneous with each other. We can say yes and to each other, not block each other's ideas, consider mistakes, opportunities. We can make each other look good up on stage or in life, and we can honor our ideas and our imagination and get very curious about others in order for scenes to go well as our relationships to go better, and to realize life is happening right now, just like a scene we're creating on stage, and to take advantage of the now. To end here in a minute, neuroscience is now looking at how we connect in this idea of collective neuroscience or resonance studies. And one of these has two people telling a story like improvisers in two different fMRI scans, and shows their sense of pleasure as well as a sense of connection to be much greater than if they were just reading something together. And I'll just end here with this image of bats and this idea that bats who spend time together tend to fly together, and they align their brain waves. And we've seen similar things with teachers in education and students who are learning, who are aligning with their teachers, like what they're learning. So thank you, everybody. I will stop there, and I'm no longer lonely in my office.
Thank you, Jeff. We are right here with you, and in many, many ways. I want to start by saying that you did indeed, as we suspected, set the record for the highest attendance in Grand Rounds. And we had over 400 people online, which I think really speaks to both the epidemic of loneliness and the way we can connect with each other when we speak honestly and genuinely, and that obviously you do so well. I'm going to read one comment right off the bat because to me it summarizes things so well, and you'll be pleased to know it comes from one of the founders of mentalization based therapy, a psychologist at the Menninger Clinic named John Allen, who I'm proud to say is also a Fairfield County native. And John wrote in, he said, "Thank you for this magnificently lucid and comprehensive presentation, which indeed exemplifies your humanity." Thank you, John, for that comment, and thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
So I'm gonna jump in with a couple quick things, and then we're gonna open it up to questions. There are already more questions than I've ever seen before a talk was even over, but please keep inputting your questions. Cheryl and I are gonna take turn and emceeing them. But I did want to point one thing out really quickly, which is the play in Fairfield. I think there was just a little typo. It is on May. I think you had said May. It's on April 9th.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, yes.
No worries. And I'm proud to say we have both the producer and the writer on the grand round. So thank you for letting us know, and wanted to correct that so everybody knows to sign up for. It's sure to be a wonderful event. So there's no way we're going to get through all the questions, but I am going to jump in with one that did come up a number of times, and would love to get some of your thoughts on, Jeff, which is a number of people asked the question about what is the relation of loneliness, and I'm going to combine two topics here, to social media or to this epidemic of Zoom. Are there advantages? Are there disadvantages? What are your thoughts about that connection?
Yeah, so I mean, there are studies around internet time and time spent in social media that actually leave generally feeling more lonely. And that studies, particularly of a little older studies of Facebook use that I'm aware of, actually leading to people feeling that they're not actually as good a cook as other people, or at the events of other people, or whatever they are, seeing that they're left out in some way, and that it doesn't actually inspire the sense of connection that they're looking for when they go on to social media often. The other question, Andrew, was
Zoom. So sort of related.
Zoom. Yeah. I don't know the literature around Zoom. I know of many experiences. And I think maybe there was something in the chat here. I would never have met you probably without Zoom. So I think there are lots of ways that this advance in technology, it's allowing a lot of us right now at this moment to connect. But if we're on Zoom all day, there is this passivity that happens that is described in the literature, that even some people need to get Zoom like special glasses in order to stay active. And I think there is something lost in the spontaneity when you have larger meetings of people being able to talk and chat like they would around a table spontaneously. It's much more difficult to do that in Zoom, and people start to feel lost and lonely on screen, like they're not relevant.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Cheryl, over to you.
Yeah, there's a wonderful question from Kathleen Murphy. She asks, should isolation be a separate diagnosis, or is it primarily a component of other psychological disorders or diagnoses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think whether that's like a V code or a primary diagnosis is a great question. But I do think that there are experiences where somebody's lonely as the primary driver, really, that then we look for symptoms of depression or symptoms of anxiety to encode it that way. But why can't loneliness be really paramount in how we think about things, and how we take care of people, and what we do as an intervention? I think we don't yet have a medicine for loneliness per se. And so it's one of those diagnoses that would involve actually something else from psychological and social and spiritual worlds, maybe psychedelic.
There's another question that is, how do you explain individuals who are in a social setting and seem engaged with others, yet still report a high level of loneliness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that relates to kind of what I was saying before about it. If we, particularly from the get-go of life or from the structures of our families, didn't feel that we belonged or were important or cared about, that when we're with other people, we're defended in the same way, per se. Like we have the same shield around us. Well, just to get very Disney-esque here, I just love the movie Frozen. I just think it's one of the most brilliant things in the world. And, you know, she has this power where her parents are saying conceal, don't feel. And so she runs away and builds an ice castle. And then actually that really needs some melting before she can actually connect with other people. And I just think that's a brilliant, brilliant story, and a story of what happens to a lot of us who need thawing of our heart, really, to feel like we're connected a little bit. That wasn't too.
I got a really poignant question from an anonymous attendee. They ask, any suggestions to help connect a young adult who doesn't recognize the impact his disconnection is having on him? He believes his online world is enough, but we worry his connections are just with others, reinforcing his negative views. Any response to that?
I'm going to turn to both of you also for a response to that. I think this is a really a really difficult situation. I think for families in terms of even how people can become isolated through technologies, kids, and parents don't know what's going on and how to connect in ways that they used to. So without knowing the situation directly, it would be hard for me to brainstorm things to do. But, you know, I would turn to the two of you who are as expert as I am in this area about ideas of how you'd think about this.
It's a very poignant, very hard question because the two-dimensional world has been the world for a lot of our young people's youth. I mean, they lost several years to COVID. And if you're 18 and 3 of those years were spent in a more COVID-esque type isolation or where things were coming back into in person, that is your world. I think it takes attempts. I think it takes school districts, it takes friends, it takes community groups, it takes faith communities to have things that engage our young people. And it's hard. I don't think there's an easy just do this response. It's trying to find probably where the young adult has something other than two dimensions that they have buy-in in their life, whether it's a sporting event, a certain type of restaurant, a play, arts, theater, community things, and finding that you can go there and say, hey, this is a no phone zone. And hopefully that might be something to dangle an engagement. But those things, you know, in a similar phenomena to bowling alone, are things that kind of fell off the radar. We're having a hard time getting them back on for everybody, but the people who had them know what they missed. The people who never had them never knew they existed. You know, the people who were middle school, young high school when COVID hit. That's my personal opinion as someone who does a little bit of work with that age group, but it's hard.
Jeff, there's a question here which relates to your discussion about doctors. It says, as physicians, we lose patients with medical illness, but as psychiatrists, we face people who suicide. And it seems to fall so much on the psychiatrist or therapist. Brings on a lot of self-doubt and an isolated feeling. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, and then there's sometimes a desire not to want to work with that with complex patient populations because of the toll that it takes. What I can say about that is, in my experience, the importance of being in supervision groups and really being able to talk to people about feelings about feeling alone with patients and feeling like you're the most important person in their life and you're all they're hanging on for sometimes. And then when you do have the opportunity to be part of a team and can expand individual work with these patients to involve a more interdisciplinary team or a group of people who can join in supporting a person, is very helpful in terms of our own burnout and our own sense of isolation, not to feel like a person's whole world is on our shoulders, and any slip in what we might say might result in a tragedy.
Sarah?
There's a wonderful question here from Amanda Craig. She asked, Do we see people with neurodivergence feel connection or loneliness different than people who are neurotypical?
I don't know about that. I don't know about the subjective experience of that. Andrew, you have more experience with this. What would you say to that
It's a
question?
really interesting question. I mean, I think that where I always start with this is to say that I think there is a misconception that individuals who are neurodivergent don't need connections as much or don't crave connections. And in my experience, that's virtually never true. But I do think, as the questioner suggests, that there are differences in the negotiation of connection. And it's very individualized. In other words, I don't know that there's any one truth for the way people who are neurodivergent, that the way they connect, any more than there's one truth about the way any of us connect. And the challenge is to how to find environments that are supportive of difference and not stigmatizing and not scapegoating, because we all know how easy it is, particularly in schools or in where young people are, to or adults for that matter, to identify someone different and then for them to be scapegoated or bullied. So, but if you find an environment that's supportive of that individual, then all sorts of good things can happen. We just have a few more minutes left, so and it's hard to know where to start. One thing I want to say is a number of people, and this is wonderful, have written in with resources, which is so cool. I mean, I think it picks up on your idea, Jeff, that there are things we can do, and you have to be creative in how you figure it out. So I'm gonna ask Jane and if there's a way that we can distribute some of these cool resources. Like one's on how to set up block parties, which I think is amazing. Another one is on a study that's with MBT, and so let's try to send those around later rather than read them out. Somebody also asked how they can sign up for the play in Fairfield, and so we can put that in the information too. I'm sure there's a link for them to do that. Let's see what else. So here's an interesting question that just came in. Having experienced loneliness myself, this is the questioner, I've noticed the extent to which loneliness is stigmatized firsthand. I found discussing personal experiences with loneliness creates a space for people to join the conversation, and most times they do. This is often difficult as I find myself being the only individual initiating these conversations, which funny enough results in me feeling isolated. Do you have any advice for how to initiate conversations around loneliness?
I want to say that I know that the Connecticut Collaborative is actually putting this as a screen in all primary care visits, or using the three question UCLA survey, and I keep thinking about what would it be like if my doctor asked me if I was lonely and what would I feel like, and I think that's just my own retained kind of stigma about the whole idea, and that actually we need to get better at this. If we're feeling lonely, it's a feeling, it's an experience, and so what do we do about it? And I think if we can think about it more together and actually realize that this is the responsibility of all of us, to tune in with people, then maybe it gets easier to ask the question like, hey, are you how are you doing? Are you feeling alone ever? Or I think there are individual ways, knowing another person, to check in that make sense given the relationship. But I think we need to know what would the meaning of the question be to the person, rather than thinking necessarily this is the best way to ask.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Cheryl, do you want to do the last one?
Sure. Let's see what I have in here. We still have lingering isolation because of COVID. There are still virtual medical visits, masks required at facilities and doctors' offices, and working virtually with limited human contact. Some people are asking when things will get back to normal, and all I can say is I don't know. Knowing that these kind of comfortable isolations from COVID, and COVID is still out there, and diseases are still out there, especially in vulnerable populations. When will we allow ourselves to take risks again to have human contact?
Starting today. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just So that's a great question. And I think, you know, we all have different medical abilities to be with people and risks and all of that. And but that aside, I think that the pandemic did something for a lot of us where there was a comfort of being home and being alone and not venturing out. So and maybe going to the market and coming home. And so I would just say, when you go to the market, is there a way to say hey to the checkout person there, and to make conversations with a neighbor who you see on the street? And is there a way to think about connecting, just to even get that part of us going, where we are trying to connect, as opposed to the force that we've all been under, which is to stay away from one another, that we hurt each other, that we can give each other viruses. What can we do to actually think about how we connect today?
Thank you, Dr. Katzman, for your inspiring presentation. And thank you to Cheryl for joining us today, and for everything both of you do for all of us at Silver Hill Hospital and everywhere to make us feel better and more connected to one another. As a reminder, for those wishing to receive continuing education credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in the browser as we end the webinar. We hope you join us again on April 10th. But for now, this concludes today's Grand Rounds. As Jeff always tells us, and I will say particularly is poignant today, prepare yourself to be left alone after this Grand Rounds, but I hope that you felt like I did, a sense of connection from learning about this and making progress. Thank you.
And Andrew, I just want to say, so before that April 10th, April 9th, like we said, is the Loneliness Cure play. And so sorry for messing that up, but hopefully everybody heard that and can get tickets.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Cheryl. Bye, everybody.